Alright, what is going on YouTube? So for today's video, I actually wanted to talk about something that I find very interesting and I've always thought was a very intriguing factor in the realm of anime and live action films and TV shows, not necessarily based on anime, but rather on comic books. And I'll explain more what I mean by that later on in this video. But the topic that we're going to be talking about is how Japanese manga is currently and has been for a while now outselling comic books in the West. So yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. Japanese manga is selling incredibly well in the West, and it seems American comics can't keep up even on their own home turf. For fans of American comics and graphic novels, there are now two major factions competing in the comics market. Western comics, particularly those published by the Big Two, namely DC and Marvel, and the vast world of Japanese manga. Manga is quite literally the Japanese version of comics, but it's also a unique art form of its own that's been seen as equal to comics for decades. But in recent years, manga has clearly overtaken comics, both in sales and in cultural relevance. Even in the West, particularly in the United States of America, where comics are seen as the mainstream and have been around for decades, manga has been consistently outselling the former. Even with action figures and the Marvel Cinematic Universe bolstering consumers' interest, comics compared poorly to manga in some key areas. From their common perception to simple price, every consumer has their own preference, and there may be no single right answer that explains how manga won the long game in the battle of manga versus comics, but manga undeniably did some things better than comics. Many news sources state that manga has been selling incredibly well in the West within the last few years, and titles such as Demon Slayer, Jujutsu Kaisen, and My Hero Academia all appeared on bestseller lists with impressive regularity. As Publishers Weekly cited, Manga Sales accounted for almost 45% of all comic books sold in 2022. Manga sales also outpaced the once dominant children's comics and helped revive comic sales in 2022. This was important since the COVID-19 pandemic decimated countless industries. Publishers Weekly also credited the surge of interest in manga to anime's unstoppable mainstream popularity. For comparison's sake, and as per Business Insider, comic sales in 2021 hit a record-breaking sale of $2.075 billion, with manga accounting for $1.47 billion. Attack on Titan was specifically cited as one of the best-selling manga titles of 2021. Meanwhile, single comics issues, which are comics' classic format, only accounted for 435 million. Clearly, manga was more mainstream and popular than ever. On the practical side of things, manga may have come out as the victor of manga versus comics, maybe because of prices and shopping venues. It was simply more budget friendly to get into manga than comics, especially when comparing the books' page count of a product to the sticker price. Single comic issues, which are around 22 pages long, may seem cheap since they cost around $5 per issue. Graphic novels or collections that have 100 pages at the very least can go for as low as $10, depending on the title. However, a typical manga volume may have around 160 to 180 pages for around $10. This was an excellent ratio for any consumer. Even if manga pages were printed in black and white as opposed to the richly colored comics, a single manga volume's sheer value was tough to beat. Another factor behind manga's victory when it came to manga versus comics was where readers can find comics and manga, not just how much they pay for them. Comic books are usually sold in specialty hobby stores, and such shops have a reputation for being intensely geeky places with a very specific type of clientele. Comic shops heavily cater to readers who are already deeply invested in comics. Robust but relatively narrow culture. Comic book movies, pop culture dominance has done little to change or improve the perception that comics were a generally male-dominated and juvenile space. Certain comics fandoms' hostility and toxicity also further soured the medium's reputation in public eye. Conversely, and despite the anime community's own fair share of controversies, manga felt more universal, and not just because of the stories found within. Manga volumes are usually sold as paperback or hardback books, and they nearly always appear in mainstream bookstores such as Barnes & Noble. Such locations are open and more welcoming to any book lover, not just comic fans who were already part of a certain fandom. This gives Japanese manga far more visibility for shoppers and potential newcomers, and this helps minimize manga's geeky aura. Anyone who visits their local Barnes & Noble in search of something fun to read will see not just romance novels and famous fantasy series, but also a huge section of manga that caters to every kind of reader out there. Manga manga actually has more in common with comics than it does with typical Barnes & Noble fare. Reading manga may just be as nerdy as a hobby as comics, but it may not feel that way to the average reader who's looking for some fun summer reading material because of where it's sold and who buys it. This was more than enough to make all the difference. Another advantage to reading manga versus comics was its very low barrier for entry. At worst, manga suffers from being read right to left, which may be mildly disorienting to new readers. Manga also tends to feature stories with slower pacing when compared to comics, due in part to the fact that it was designed to be released on a weekly basis in Japan. Comics, conversely, are released monthly, meaning a single issue's pace is faster and more concise than a full manga volume. For example, a face-off between two superpowered characters can be concluded in one comic issue, but could take multiple manga volumes to finish. Fortunately for the manga industry, manga's narrative advantages are much bigger, starting with how linear manga is. Any manga series has one straightforward story, and the volumes go in order and beyond. For example, volume 1 is followed by volume 2 and 3, and so forth. This makes manga more similar to serialized novels that are meant to be read in order. On the other hand, comics tend to be all over the place. Even if comic publishers make an effort to provide clear entry points and detailed guides for their countless rebooted universes, alternate universes, and new storylines, it can still be too daunting and overwhelming for potential newcomers to even start. Manga doesn't suffer from a confusing, decades-old web of interconnected stories, endless retcons, and alternate continuities to sort through. Manga that came with such baggage like sprawling cosmic epic that is Dragon Ball or Mobile Suit Gundam's different centuries and histories were the exceptions, not the rule. I mean, Dragon Ball is not that hard to follow, like, let's be real. But anyway, meanwhile, this kind of imposing world building was the norm in comics. Every mainstream superhero, like Spawn or Wonder Woman, had tons of lore and continuities for newcomers to study. This hasn't even covered the team comics, which starred multiple characters with their own individual histories separate from the team's united stories. Things often go so convoluted in comics that even a complete continuity reboot like the X-Men Krakoa era was still built on the X-Men's countless past iterations. Manga may also be selling better than comics because of their more accessible content. Comics appealed greatly to superhero enthusiasts and fans of gritty, hyper-masculine deconstructions of the former. It's hard not to see comics as a juvenile art form and hobby, mainly made for men by men. Comics made for different genres, ages, and genders have always been around, and the industry has recently taken great strides to diversify the artists they hire and to whom they sell comics to. It's also worth noting that the indie comics have been going strong since the 90s, with the late 2010s being a great time for new indie artists and writers. However, these tend to be overshadowed by the mainstream, manly titles and genres. What's more, the industry still predominantly caters to male-coded interests, action, crime, horror, and sci-fi. This prevailing mindset was partly the reason why Batman continues to be the highest selling superhero comic, and why violent action comics will always have an audience. This self-imposed rigidity greatly limited who bought comics or made them, making the media too niche when contrasted to the endless possibilities of manga. Sales reflected the ever-widening divide between manga versus comics. The manga industry also suffers from its own problems and its own version of the systematic sexism that's been holding comics back for decades, but it undeniably pushed more genres and kinds of stories than comics do. Only the already dedicated fans would spend serious cash on yet another reboot of the Avengers or Superman, or on another reprint of one of DC's or Marvel's iconic storylines from yesteryear. Conversely, anyone can fall in love with the more down-to-earth stories found in the slice of life, romance, or comedy manga series. Manga has plenty of action series too, such as Shonen Jump's ongoing Dark Trio, the successors of the legendary Big Three, this article, and seinen titles like Vagabond and Berserk. But manga as a whole simply has more variety. This, unsurprisingly, attracts far more readers, especially younger ones. The diverse portfolio, along with its low barriers to entry, high visibility in bookstores, excellent prices, makes manga the industry juggernaut it is, beating comics at their own game on their own home turf. When it comes to manga versus comics, manga was the clear winner. Oof. Wow, so yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But the thing I was kind of talking about in the beginning of this video, or hinting at, is the fact that I've always found it so strange how manga has been outselling comic books for years, yet comic books have one of the biggest marketing tools, or marketing in general, like of all time, which is these $1 million Hollywood movies. Like, you would think, oh, people would probably buy comics way more, especially in the West, because we have this MCU, we have all these big, huge Hollywood movies just dominating the theaters, and that's gotta be like the biggest marketing of all time. Here's this huge movie. If you're interested, you know, and you want more, buy the comics or read the comics, right? But despite having such a huge presence and dominance of, you know, live action films and the theaters and everything, the MCU essentially taking over the hero movie genre, despite all of that, comics are still not outselling manga, and that's always been crazy to me, especially, you know, me being someone who was always into anime and always into manga way before it got actually popular in the US. I've just always found that very, very interesting. So now I find it even more interesting with the fact that anime is now getting its toes into live action adaptations a lot more. So that's only going to add to the marketing for, you know, manga and I guess also anime. So I think it's just really interesting and really cool. And yeah, anything that can help my favorite form of art to go further, you know, I'm about it, especially if it's a form of art that I also make, being film. So yeah, I always thought that that was very interesting, and I've always kind of wondered why that is. And well, this article really helped explain why that is and gave us multiple reasons. So yeah, I thought it would make for a pretty good video. But what are your guys' thoughts on this? Do you think this accurately sums up why manga has been outselling comics for years? Or do you think there's a different reason? Let me know in the comments below. Please leave a like on the video and subscribe if you haven't already. That helps me out a ton. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And I'll see y'all in the next video.